The idea of the project is to capture everything about food production, consumption, processing that has taken place in Fingal over the centuries. Fingal is well known for its horticulture, its agriculture and its fishing. Indeed, it was called the breadbasket of Dublin back in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's also about capturing the social history. One of the production centres for food across Fingal were the big houses. And today we're going to hear from Cathal Dowd Smith, curator at Newbridge House.
I'm Cathal Dowd Smith. I'm the curator and collections manager of Newbridge House and Farm, owned by Fingal County Council, but which preserves a very large collection of upstairs and downstairs social life in Newbridge over the past 300 years. The kitchen is often referred to as the sort of engine room of the house, and that's because of all the hard work that would have gone into preparing these banquets, these big feasts that the Cobb family and other big families would have had in houses like this. The kitchen is right at the back of the house. It's far away from the dining room because of the smells and the workload and the heat and all the kind of stuff that would have been going on. But it's also a very large space. It's one of the largest rooms in the basement. It's right at the back of the house, so it's very near the wall garden where all the food would have been coming from in the farm, and the pump in the courtyard where the water would have been coming from. And it was the cook's domain. We have this iconic sort of glazed partition, so the cook could have locked herself in to stop all the other staff distracting her own staff. So she's got sort of control. And she would have had a whole host of kitchen maids of different ranks working under her. And other pantry boys and other people coming in, delivering food, taking stuff away, fetching pails of water, and then all the different kitchen maids and scullery maids preparing. All the veg would have been produced on site, so then it would have all had to been prepared and washed and cooked and boiled. And you'll see we have our large Georgian open fireplace, where all the food would have been boiled over the fire, or open roasted, spit roasted, which would have had to been tendered, and all the meat would have to be prepared. Or we've got the later Victorian range, which would be coal fired, and all of the big pots, the big copper pots that would have had to be lifted and filled and prepared, and the ovens as well, so they could control temperature, which was a big innovation in the Victorian age, so they could bake pies and tarts and make their own different sort of cuisines inspired by the continent. And then some of the collection of utensils we've got as well really kind of shows the amount of prep that they would have had to gone in to producing all the meals. So a lot of big, large pestles and mortars for preparing all of their herbs and seeds and spices, because they would have produced all their own meat on the estate. They would have salted it to preserve it throughout the rest of the year, and then they would have had to flavour that, because otherwise everything would just taste of salt. So a lot of pepper and spices and things they would have brought in from around the world, and then they would prepare them and season the meats themselves. They would have had their own dairy on the farm in Newbridge as well, so they were producing all their own milk, all their own cream, cheese and butter as well. And they would have had butter molds and things to decorate the butter before it went up to table. They would have cheese covers. They would make different types of cheese and they'd preserve them, Indian cheeses, softer cheeses. So they had a whole range of different food styles that they could produce from the one estate. And it was all about showing off their status. But the way they showed off that status was about the amount of preparation that had to go into all these meals and all the kind of workload. A lot of the staff in the kitchen would have necessarily been local, because they wouldn't have necessarily been seen upstairs. A lot of we can go off the names in the wage books. Mrs. Mulhall was one of the cooks. She was here for a while, and Mrs. Little was here during the famine. But the cooks seemed to change a lot more than the other staff at Newbridge, because it was very competitive, and the cook was sort of behind all the food that you were producing and what the family was eating, what they were showing off to their guests. And as well, in Fingal's situation close to the city centre, there would have been a lot of competition for good cooks, particularly in the 19th century, with hotels and gentlemen's clubs and restaurants opening up in Dublin. So there would have been a lot of competition from the country houses for different kind of cooks. And then all the kitchen maids, the scullery maids, they would have come from the sort of local area. So you could be talking about anywhere up to 10 people all just working in and out of the kitchen, as well as all the outside staff bringing in the food, and the cook would have worked very closely, with the gardener in what are they producing, what's in season, what's available, and all that kind of stuff. We know from a lot of the accounts that the housekeeper would have ordered food from elite grocers in Dublin. there was a firm on the quays in Dublin called Kinahan and Sons, where a lot of deliveries would have gone. We can see that the coachman would have been sent into Dublin to bring back these deliveries from elite grocers, things that they were buying from that were produced around the world, also to show their wealth and their status. They would have been buying rum and brandy and sort of liquor and things like that to make drinks. They would have been buying a lot of lemons and oranges to make cakes and to serve with seafood. They would have eaten a lot of seafood from the local area. So a lot of their elite stuff was coming from the grocers, and then they were buying things like bread came from the bakery in Swords, because they didn't have a bakery on site in Newbridge. The fish came from local places like Howth and Skerries. They would have been buying all their fish from local fish merchants in the neighbouring towns. And then they would have been producing a lot of stuff widely on the estate. All the game they would have hunted themselves, and all the vegetables and the potatoes and things like that they were buying. The sort of cook's day would have started with preparing breakfast for the family, between the breakfast that would have gone to the nursery, the breakfast for Mrs. Cobb and the breakfast for Mr. Cobb. And then there would be the servants' breakfast after that. And then there'd be a gap until lunch, which would have been a main meal for the family in the centre of the day, which would have been then their sort of dinner. And then they would have been very late in the evening, about 8 o'clock they would have dined, and that's when the guests would have called, and they would have had a meal. We know from family accounts that in the 18th century that meal would have gone on for 4 or 5 hours. And the food would have all been served at once. So there was a huge pressure on the cook to have all the dishes prepared at the same time. And all the food went up. They didn't eat in courses like we did today. All the food was laid on the table, and that was known as eating in the French style, or à la française. So that would have been a hugely impressive feat as well, when the guests would have been sitting around the table and all of this food would arrive up from the kitchens at once, and then there'd be refreshes of the table and they'd add more food to it. And they would have eaten like that right the way up until the 1860s. 1870s, when they would have started eating in a more broken up style, with courses, dishes, one after the other. This is one of the very clever labour saving devices, and it kind of goes to show how much work would have gone into so much. So they would have put a lot of effort into anything that would help reduce the time spent on doing things. So this is like a vegetable guillotine for preparing vegetables, and it's a very clever mechanism. There would be normally a bowl here as well that would propel around, so it would mix all the vegetables as it was chopping them, and it just sort of, so it would have made some difference in the kind of preparation of all the vegetables. This is a galantine mould, which is a very popular dish in the Victorian age, which was cold pressed meats preserved in jelly or aspic. So it would be basically like a sausage, but made up of different mixtures of meats like veal and chicken and pork, and all these meats pressed together and then preserved with eggs and like hard-boiled eggs and spices in this roll. And we know there was a very famous dinner here in the 1840s when Fanny Kemble, the famous London actress, came for dinner, and we know that she was served galantine. So it's very interesting to have one of these galantine moulds in the collection. One of the many butter moulds that we have in the collection, which are hand carved out of timber, and they would make different shells. So this one depicts sort of leaf patterns and a bird. So they would have moulded the butter they produced on the estate just to make it presentable at table. So they weren't just delivering up a big chunk of butter, and they were all in different sort of presses. We have another one here, which is a sort of sheaf of corn, which is very interesting to show the kind of motifs they would have been serving at the table. So we have a huge collection of beer flagons as well that would have all the beer would have been delivered to the estate. We know that they bought a lot of beer from the brewery in Swords, but also from the big breweries in Dublin. They would have bought different grades of beer for different occasions, and a lot of them come with their stamp names. So this one from Mitchell's and Son on Kildare Street as well. So there's a huge wealth of knowledge in the kind of collection here at Newbridge of all the different trades and the different commercial history and the social life of where everything was coming from, and the sort of economy throughout the 19th century of production and consumption, and how the elite households were eating and what they were eating. This is a very interesting thing. This is one of our many pieces of culinary equipment that's to do with coffee, because we know they would have drank an awful lot of coffee, and it would have been a very elite thing to be serving, particularly in the 18th and early 19th century. This coffee mill for grinding up coffee beans is very interesting. It was made by Peugeot and Sons, who later became very famous as car manufacturers. So you can kind of see the sort of mechanical history of how different firms developed. These are some of the archive material that we have, that we're very lucky to have at Newbridge, because the Cobb family have retained their family archive at Newbridge. It goes back over 300 years since the beginning of Newbridge. And these are just some of the farm and garden account books that we have that show the kind of wealth of knowledge and history that's kept here at Newbridge, that they detail all the kind of stuff that they were producing on the farm, that they were selling in huge quantities. So you get an idea of how big the operation was here, the kind of market values as the economy changes, particularly sort of post the Napoleonic Wars, how the production of the garden and everything came so central to the Cobb's sort of finances. So you've got whole sort of lists here of all. This page, for example, shows you all the butter that was sold from the estate that they were producing from the dairy. Then Lannistown was a big farm for the Cobbs. It was their sort of home farm. It shows you all the oats and the straw and the hay and everything they were selling in huge quantities from the farm. And then other things like from the gardens, all the onions that they were able to sell. Obviously they would have kept enough to feed the household, and then everything surplus was sold at market. And you can see all the black and red currants. There's artichokes, cucumbers, melons, asparagus, all these kind of like really high-end vegetables that the Cobbs were able to produce with the technology in their wall garden, with the resources of the gardener and all the gardening assistants they had, but also the glass houses, all the melons and cucumbers they could grow, and the kind of expertise that went into producing that and then selling it at market. The markets would have been in Dublin. They would have sent everything in by cart into the likes of Smithfield Market, where they would have been selling all the fruit and veg. And they would have known. There's some local people that have recalled how they remember they used to be able to come up in the mid 20th century to Newbridge and buy directly from the gardener in his office in the courtyard. You could buy the apples and the potatoes from the gardener. But then more centrally, people went into Dublin and they could buy Newbridge apples by the barrel load, or Newbridge potatoes from Smithfield Market. So this is the servants' dining hall at Newbridge. This is where the servants for 250 years would have ate their 3 meals a day. And having a job in a big country house like Newbridge, we had a very productive home farm and an elite sort of walled garden. You would have had available to you as a servant all these kind of dishes that made by a world-class cook down in the kitchen that you wouldn't have necessarily had at home. A lot of the staff, particularly the lower off staff, the housemaids and the footmen who would have been starting their careers here, would have come from quite modest backgrounds in the local Fingal area, and they would have been introduced to all these kind of dishes that they wouldn't have necessarily got at home. It would have been a combination of what was produced on the farm and then things collected from the hedgerows and from the estate made into dishes for the servants. And it was a part of their sort of their jobs, incentives. The servants would have been paid quarterly, but they would have been fed every day, 3 times a day. They would have been clothed by their employer, and they would have been given accommodation and shelter. So really it was a part of the sort of package of employment. It was that sort of deal of what you're being fed. And then upstairs as well, the family would have been eating all these amazing meals, quite different from what the servants would have been eating, and a lot more variety, a lot more meat, a lot less vegetables, and a lot more complicated sort of dishes that required a lot more effort to go into them. And they would have been served by these staff. So the experience of food in a country house would have been a big thing for the employees working here. They would have got to experience a lot of different things that they wouldn't have necessarily outside of the country house. So this is our really exciting find from the Newbridge archive kept by the Cobb family at Newbridge. This is the recipe book that begins in 1806, but predates that. It's a collection of all the family's favourite recipes going right the way back into the Georgian era. And it's kept by Mrs. Cobb, by 2 different Mrs. Cobbs. It's handed on to her daughter-in-law after a while. But it preserves for the family all their favourite recipes. So when they would have gone travelling to other households, when they would have been in England and they would have eaten these dishes that they would have liked, they would preserve them all in here and they would be given different recipes. And some of them are ascribed and they tell us who they're given by. There's a whole wealth of information as well from the kind of stuff that they were buying and producing and eating, but also what they were producing at Newbridge and what they were trying to preserve. So preservation was a huge part of what they were doing. So we know we have a huge orchard here at Newbridge, so they were producing an awful lot of apples and pears and cherries, and then it was about preserving those fruits to make them last the year long. So drying apples, pickling apples, bottling them, cherry brandy, pickled pears, and then in the greenhouses they would have been growing cucumbers and melons, pickling melon, drying cucumber, doing all these kind of crazy things. So an awful lot of vinegar was spent in pickling and preserving over the years in Newbridge. I'm pretty sure you could be guaranteed when you walked into the kitchen there'd always be a faint whiff of vinegar from something pickling away. Also a lot of brandies and drinks and wines, currant wines, white currant wine, which was used to season and flavour bacon. And there's a huge amount of meat and things that are used in flavouring and serving up dishes. There's a recipe here you'll see for turnip soup, which is made from veal or mutton broth and is flavoured with bacon and ham. So it's all very interesting to kind of think of what they were mixing together, like turnips, which in the 19th century would have been very well known as, you know, animal feed, but then they were making soup out of it, but making it that little bit more elite by mixing it with things they had available to them. A lot of use of hog's lard and other materials that they would have had widely available to them from the farm here. One of the very unusual recipes in the book is there's a recipe for cream cakes, which is given to the family from Ali Matthews. And we know from family accounts and letters that Ali Matthews started life as the dairy maid for the Archbishop way back in the 1750s and 60s. So this shows that all the way up until the 1820s, she was still living and working at Newbridge. It's very interesting to think that the family would have been preserving a recipe that would have been given to them by one of their very close members of staff. So there's a whole range of different tiers of society. There's a recipe for the Marquis of Granby's small beer, and then other recipes that they would have been collecting in England from friends, and also from Irish friends from other houses they would have gone to, like the O'Briens in Dromoland Castle, or from the Power Trenches in Galbally, in Ballinasloe and Galway, or from the Butlers in Kilkenny. So as they would have travelled around, the women would have been exchanging and corresponding and sharing these kind of recipes, and they would have been passed down to the cook then to produce and to show off. And there's a huge wealth of information in what they don't say in the recipes as well, what they know that the cook already knows. They leave a lot of the seasoning up to the cook, but then they'll also specify, use fresh milk for this, don't use stale milk but fresh milk, or use the driest of the salt in the kitchen, because a lot of this stuff would have been sitting about and there would have been different ranges. There's different types of sugar, whether it's lump sugar or grated sugar or exotic sort of things like demerara sugar, brown sugar, things like that. So it's very interesting the things that they do have to specify and sort of make clear. But then there's a lot of stuff like quantities, they're very loose and sort of at the cook's discretion about what she's going to use. So we're here in the wall garden in Newbridge House, which dates back to the 1740s, at the time that the current Newbridge House was built. The old orchard used to be outside the front of the house on display for all the visitors arriving. But then the trend from the sort of middle of the 18th century was to produce these large wall gardens. The walls created a special microclimate in which more crops could be grown quicker at better temperatures. The wall garden here is about 5 acres, so it's rather on the large size. We know that there were glass houses going right the way back to the 18th century, where they would have been growing peaches, melons and cucumbers. The current glass houses that you see here behind me were updated and put in 1905. They're made by Messenger and Son from England, firm brought over. There was a propagation house which is still here, and there's also a vinery, so they started growing grapes and peaches as well. This current crop of trees was laid out in the early 20th century. They're mostly English market garden varieties of apples, like Granny Smith's, Brambles and Worcesters. But we think that back in the 18th century, there would have been more Irish varieties of apples and other fruits. They grew a lot of soft fruit here. They would have grown, yes, apples and pears, but also cherries, damsons, a whole host of softer fruits like currants and gooseberries, and then peaches and nectarines. And they also grew almonds and walnuts, a whole host of things being produced here, and then some vegetables. And we know that throughout the different periods and the different Mrs. Cobbs who lived here, bits of the garden would have been given over to cultivate certain crops of interest to Mrs. Cobb. So we know that Lady Betty liked to dabble in apothecary medicine, so she would have had a herb garden to produce the different herbs for her that would have had sort of medicinal qualities. And then we know that in the 20th century, the different Mrs. Cobbs liked to dabble in gardens as well, so they would grow cut flower borders for themselves for use in the house. The wall garden at Newbridge is a part of the farm experience. The farm itself also dates back to the 18th century. There's original 8 Georgian pigsties, and Fingal County Council keep the farm at Newbridge as a traditional living working farm, which is now part of the rare breed strategy for Ireland. And the wall garden is at the centre of all that. It's all about what would have historically been for producing, for production, for market gardening then in the 20th century, for feeding Newbridge, and for also creating an economy, for a kind of productive space that you can sell at market and create extra income for the household to sort of keep the house and the family going.